So, hi everyone, welcome to CPS on Wednesday lunchtime. Thank you for coming along. So today we've got a really exciting talk from Dr. Andrew Steele. He's a biologist and science writer, but started off his career with a PhD in physics and then completed some postdoctorates in computational biology. And he's just published a book on the science of aging. And so he'll be talking to us about that today. So, Dr. Andrew Steele.
Hi, thank you, and great to see a copy of the book in the wild. That's very exciting for an author, as I'm sure you can imagine. So I wanted to tell you all about this exciting science that I spent the last couple of years researching. I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about myself first. I actually started out not as a biologist, but as a physicist. I got all the way to the end of a PhD in physics. And I actually changed career because of a graph, and that's a graph I'm going to be referring to quite a number of times during this talk. This is the book that I wrote. It's called Ageless, The New Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old, and it's out in the UK. It's coming out in the US in a few weeks' time. And the case that the book tries to make is that aging isn't what a lot of people think of it as. You know, a lot of people, when they think of aging, they think of a natural process, something that's unavoidable, something that's inevitable. And actually, it's not necessarily entirely a bad thing. Because as you age, you accrue wisdom, you get older, you might have a family, you might have children, might have grandchildren. There are all kinds of exciting and wonderful things that happen to us as we age. But I try and make the case that when you view aging as from the perspective of a biologist, then aging is arguably the greatest humanitarian challenge of our time. And that might sound a bit weird, so I'm going to unpack that a bit at the start of the talk. And that might be quite a depressing book. I'm presenting it as this huge cause of death and suffering, this enormous humanitarian challenge. But the exciting thing is that aging isn't inevitable. We now know that through a variety of different ways that we can intervene, from things that we've known about for decades to things that are absolutely brand new biological techniques, we can slow down the aging process and we can even reverse it in the lab. And that's everything, not just in cells, we can do it in flies and mice, all kinds of animals. And we're just starting to see the first of these treatments make their way into human trials. So it's a really exciting time in terms of the biology of aging and in terms of the medicine of aging as well. So on the one hand, we've got this enormous humanitarian challenge. And on the other, we've got the scientific tools to potentially rise to that challenge. And that's what I think makes this such an exciting area of research right now. And I think actually it could lead to the greatest revolution in basically the history of medicine since the discovery of antibiotics. And I'll talk a bit about why that is a bit later on. So as I said, I basically changed career because of a graph, and I'm going to start by showing you that graph. It's quite a simple one, but it's a little bit morbid. You can see on here, you've got your age in years along the bottom, and up the side, you've got your chance of death in that given year. And let's have a look at what it looks like. It looks like that. Now, all of us know that old people are more likely to die, but I actually found the results on this graph pretty surprising. So let's just sort of go through it from youngest to oldest. You start at age 0 when you're born. You've got about a 0.5% chance of not making it to your first birthday in the rich parts of the world. And that's basically, you could be born with some kind of genetic problem or a congenital issue, or, you could just get unlucky and get an infection in that first year of life when you're very vulnerable. But if you make it to that, through that first sort of dangerous year, after that, things are very safe for a surprisingly long time. Things actually carry on getting safer all the way through your early childhood until you reach the age of about 10. And current 10-year-olds are actually the safest humans in the history of humanity. It's absolutely incredible. They've got a chance of dying somewhere in the region of 1 in 10,000 in that year. But unfortunately, on this graph, it's all downhill, or rather, looking at this curve uphill from there. And so we got from 10-year-olds 1 in 10,000. If you're aged 18, your odds of death are about 1 in 3,000 every year. Still not too bad. If you're in your 30s, like I am, your odds of death are somewhere in the region of 1 in 1,000. And it's worth just thinking about what that would actually mean if that were to continue. If those odds were to carry on throughout the rest of my life, I could live into my 1,030s on average. So obviously that isn't what happens. Even though the human body is capable of maintaining itself in a sufficiently stable state that it can have only 1 in 1,000 odds of dying at certain times in your life, that unfortunately doesn't persist through the decades. In fact, there's a number called the mortality rate doubling time, which does exactly what it says on the tin. It tells you how fast your risk of death doubles. And the speed of that doubling is about 8 years in humans. So that means it grows exponentially. And what that means, well, we've all seen the results of exponential growth with coronavirus in the last year or so. And so it can start out fairly small, fairly innocuous, and then get very big very quickly. So actually, most of us have a pretty chilled out first 4, 5, maybe even 6 decades of life. But by the time you're into your 60s, when you're 65, you pass this threshold of a 1% chance of death in that year. And that's still not bad. If you were able to continue that for the rest of your life, you'd still live to be 165 on average. But of course, that inexorable doubling continues and continues. By the time you reach the age of 80, you've got about a 5% chance of dying in that year, 1 in 20. And if you're lucky enough to make it into your 90s, somewhere off the top of the graph, then what you'll find is that your risk of death in a given year in your 90s is up to or even over 1 in 6. That's basically life or death at the roll of a dice. And so why did this graph change my career? Well, on the one hand, it's quite depressing. It's quite morbid. As a human being, you look at this and think, my God, I've got this enormous exponentially increasing wall of mortality chasing me down toward the end of life. But as a scientist, you can look at this and say, it's awfully strange that all these different things that kill us tend to grow exponentially with time. They all onset, in their most serious forms at around the same time. So perhaps there's some kind of underlying fundamental process driving this whole thing. And maybe if we could intervene in that process, obviously the aging process, then we could start to slow down, reverse that process. We could push some of these ways that we can die, some of these horrible diseases further and further into the future and decrease the suffering that they cause. So we're going to have to ask the question, what is aging? And aging is, of course, a huge variety of different things. First, there are the superficial signs. There are things like the wrinkles and the grey hair that all of us associate with getting old. But what these show is that, something's going on the outside. Something is also happening on the inside. And the stuff that happens on the inside can be an awful lot scarier. It's increase in odds of all kinds of major diseases. In fact, all the major killers in the modern world are essentially caused by the aging process. Things like cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia, all just become dramatically more likely as we get older. Then there's the stuff that isn't, then there's the stuff that's the loss, basically. You've got vision loss, muscle loss, hearing loss, all of these different things combined together because our organs in our body, they're winding down, they're failing in certain cases. And what this ultimately means, whatever faculty it is that you lose first, ultimately it goes on to cause a loss of independence because, if you can't hear, it makes it harder, it makes it more dangerous to cross the road at a very basic level. But it means, you're denied social interaction. Or, if you lose muscle strength, it gets harder to, maybe at first it's hard to play with your grandkids. Maybe later it's harder to get up the stairs or open tops of jars, just get around and do stuff that you like to do around the house, really basic everyday tasks. So aging conspires to sap all of our independence as well. And then there's the stuff that isn't really related directly to aging. I've got 2 examples here of infections and injuries, but aging just makes it so much more likely that those things are going to have terrible consequences. Because, say you break a bone as a teenager or as a young adult, then, it might mean a few weeks in a plaster cast. But if you break a bone as an older adult, you might end up in hospital. You've got a weakened immune system, so you might catch a secondary infection in hospital, and that then can basically either dramatically change or even end your life. So it's just this huge range of different changes. So we're going to just go back to this graph again. Obviously, what's causing all of these deaths? These aren't benign deaths of old age, as people sometimes talk about. People aren't just dying painlessly in their sleep. They are dying of all these horrible diseases and all these horrible alterations to our biology. So to show you what some of those look like, cancer, that's how the risk of cancer goes up with age, the risk of heart disease, the risk of stroke. All of these things, all by slightly different amounts, seem to increase exponentially, approximately, at a very similar time in our lives. Dementia is actually an even stronger example. It's something that unless you've got a particular family disposition, basically you've got a predisposition from a genetic mutation, it's almost unheard of in anyone under the age of 60. But after that age, it doubles every 5 or so years, which is actually faster than the risk of death itself. So you can see it just shoots up. And I mentioned infectious diseases. The chance of getting a chest infection, obviously that's relatively likely throughout life. As you can see, it never drops that far below 2% a year. But nonetheless, at a very young age, when your immune system hasn't properly developed to learn all the different infections that are sort of out there, and as you get older, again, that takes off because your immune system is weakening. You enter this process of immunosenescence. You've got things like chronic inflammation, which we might talk a bit about later. So you can see that these just cause loads and loads, basically, of suffering, because all of these ways to go aren't particularly pleasant. Heart disease, cancer, these are all things that you can suffer from for years, and they can sap your independence, they can sap your strength, they can have very grueling treatments as well before you ultimately go on to die. And so that's what really worries me about the aging process. To give one just more contemporary example, we've got also the risk of death from coronavirus. And this is your chance, if you're infected, of going on to die. And again, it's just this absolutely phenomenal exponential curve. I think someone in their 80s is literally hundreds of times more likely to die of COVID than someone who catches it in their 20s or 30s as a young adult. So this is for a variety of different reasons. It's because of your immune system losing its functionality. It's because of the fact that your body is just less resilient. You've got what's called less reserve overall to sort of deal with external stresses. And that means that there's this exponentially increasing risk of death from COVID. So again, if we just all had slightly biologically younger bodies and slightly biologically younger immune systems, this pandemic would still be a terrible thing, but it would be taking a much smaller toll on our society than it is at the moment, with us all aging at the sort of quote unquote natural pace. So back to my favorite graph. you might be looking at this and thinking, well, these are all horrible. These are all things that happen in late life. They do kill us slowly. There's a huge amount of suffering here. But is this something that we in the rich world are sort of, in some perverse way, lucky to have, because we all live long enough to experience these terrible diseases and dysfunctions? Well, normally in the pre-Zoom world, I do an audience quiz and try and get people to guess life expectancy. But since we aren't, unfortunately, in that world at the moment, just think to yourself, what do you think global life expectancy is? Because what you find is when you do surveys of these things, people tend to massively underestimate global life expectancy, because often we're taught that there's a very large developing world where things are much worse, healthcare is much worse, income's much worse, and so people live a much shorter time. But actually, the most recent data I've got for global life expectancy, so every country in the world, is from 2019, and drum roll please, I think I've drawn this out quite long enough, it's 72.6 years. Now, on the one hand, that's a really, really good thing. That means that more people all around the world are living longer and healthier lives than ever before. It means we're living in a stage of human history where, for the first time, really, most children born in most countries are going to get the chance to grow old. But on the flip side, you can see that 72.6 is already plenty of the way up this exponential curve. And remember, this is obviously an average, so a substantial fraction of people live longer than that, as well as shorter. And that means that people in every country of the world are suffering from these various age-related diseases. So it's not just something that we're lucky enough to have in the rich world because of our extended life expectancies. And in fact, what this means is that out of the approximately 150,000 people who die every day on planet Earth, somewhere in the region of 2/3 of those deaths, in fact, a bit more than that, die essentially of aging. They die of all these diseases we talked about: cancer, heart disease, dementia, and so on. And that means that if you take all of the other causes of death, add them together and double them, you don't get anywhere, you still don't quite reach the amount of people who are killed of aging. And that is why I think this is the world's greatest humanitarian challenge, because we've got this huge number of people dying. And even if you're not worried about the death itself, because we all have to go sometime after all, it's causing them to suffer for years or decades beforehand, slowly losing their independence, becoming frail, potentially losing their minds, their memories, their personalities, all of these horrible things that can happen to us as we get diseases as we get older. So this could be quite a depressing thesis, as I said, but I'm just going to go back and ask, what can we do about this? Well, I'm going to show you this graph, and this is the last time I'm going to show you this graph. It's obviously got a deep resonance for me because it caused me to change my career. But you can see this is the risk of death for humans. Let's think about what some other animals look like. This is a simple freshwater creature called the hydra. It's about 1 centimeter long. And the reason these things first came to the attention of scientists is because they've got incredible regenerative powers. Basically, if you chop anything that you like off a hydra, chop it in half, chop one of its little spiky bits off or anything like that, it can then go on to form a second whole hydra. Because they're able to basically go back in time and turn themselves back into stem cells and regenerate into an entirely new organism. And so this was really amazing that scientists were trying to sort of dig into their biology, work out what it was that allowed them to unlock this regenerative power even after they've matured as adults. But what's happened is that as a sort of side effect of doing this research, they've started noticing how frequently, or rather infrequently, these creatures die. And hydra, their chance of death actually looks more like this. And as you can see, it continues right out onto this side of the graph as well. Their chance of death per year is about 0.2%. And as well as being phenomenally low, it also is absolutely constant, or pretty much constant with time. We obviously haven't done the experiment to find out if it really would make it all the way out to 1,000 years, but we think that if this chance of death continued, and there's no reason to think that it wouldn't stay constant, given that we've watched them for quite a number of years already, then approximately 10% of them would still be alive after a millennium. So, maybe we're not going to get all the way to the stage where the hydra is, but what we'd like to do is push humanity away from this exponential risk of death and a bit more toward this flat risk of death that's less dependent on how long ago you were born, called negligible senescence. Now, you might be thinking, hydra, they're a weird little pond creature. They've only got a handful of cells. They're so distant from humans. What can we possibly hope to learn from them? Or what can we possibly hope to apply from their biology? But actually, the reason that this is the beautiful creature on the front of my book is because it too is negligibly senescent. This is the Galápagos tortoise, and the record-breaking, or the record-holding Galápagos tortoise lived to, we think, about 175, 177 years old. She was called Harriet, might have belonged to Charles Darwin. She's got this rather incredible origin story. But most critically, as I say, these tortoises have negligible senescence. That means that they've got a chance of death that doesn't change depending on how long ago they were born. And also, they don't senesce in other ways. They don't get frail. They continue reproducing right up until late life as well. There's a current, not a Galápagos tortoise, but another kind of giant tortoise called Jonathan, who's the current world's oldest. He's coming up on his 190th birthday, and there's an article in a newspaper a few years ago about how he likes to get on with the ladies. So he's still very much living a full life in spite of his incredibly extended years. And again, tortoises aren't particularly close to humans, but this is a mammal. This is something called, well, you might be looking at it and thinking it looks like a penis with teeth, but actually it's a naked mole rat. And these are creatures that they're mammals like us. They're about the size of a rat or a mouse, and their lifespan is about 30 years. And that's incredible because if things like rats, mice, they live a couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years at the outside in the lab if you really look after them. But this thing carries on into its 30s potentially. And not only that, again, it doesn't seem to get any more frail, even though it looks incredibly wrinkly. This is just how they look. They live in these underground burrows, and they need to have very saggy fur to be able to squeeze past the other naked mole rats that they come across in these narrow tunnels that they dig. But actually, they stay fertile. They stay equally. They don't become frail, etc., etc. In fact, it was thought that these guys were completely immune to cancer until a few years ago, when just a handful of tumors were discovered in a very, very big colony of them in the lab. So they've obviously got at least significant resistance to some of these diseases of old age. So what's going on in the biology of these animals? Everything from hydra to naked mole rats that allows them to be negligibly senescent. And is this something that we as humans could hope to emulate? Well, I'm going to start by perhaps the most reliable intervention in aging. It's certainly the one that we've known about the longest. It's related to what you eat, and it's called dietary restriction. And now this isn't just a diet. This isn't just cutting back slightly what you eat in order to lose a bit of weight. This is the idea of cutting back your calories by a huge, huge amount. The experiments that are done on mice and rats in the lab, and actually some of the experiments on calorie restriction in humans as well, I've seen a cutting back of the amount that people consume by about 40%. So that's a huge cutback, and it's something that you continue every single day. There are these other ideas like intermittent fasting, where you can only eat every other day or something like that to try and emulate these effects. But basically, all of these things are very, very large cutback in your calories. But what we found is that universally, almost across the animal kingdom, we see increases in lifespan and increases, most importantly, in healthy lifespan. From yeast and worms, these tiny little things that we can look at in the lab, to flies and spiders, different insects and stuff across the sort of kingdom of the invertebrates. There are mice and rats, obviously. Actually, rats were the first creatures it was shown to work in. Bigger animals like lemurs and dogs have some effect on this calorie restriction as well. And then monkeys, maybe. The longest experiment that's ever been done on this was something that started in the late 80s and then has continued on until about 5 or 10 years ago, looking at rhesus monkeys, which live sort of 30 or 40 years naturally. I'll talk a bit about those results in a moment. But basically, this is an incredibly universal result. It shows that loads and loads of different animals, not just animals, loads and loads of different creatures have this ability to increase their lifespan. And to show you what that means, I'm going to show you a graph, actually from the first ever experiment to reliably show that this effect worked. This is from a 1935 paper by a scientist called Clive Mackay. It's something called a survival curve, which if you're a biologist or a medic, you're probably going to be very used to reading already. The idea is that along the bottom, you've got how old the animals are, and because they're rats, those are ages in days. And then up the side, you've got the percentage of the animals that have survived until that point in time. And so this is what the survival curve looks like for the animals that eat ad libitum. That means they can eat basically whatever they want. And then the survival curve to contrast it against is this one, which is the animals that are on DR. They've had a restricted ration, basically. And what you can see is that the ad libitum animals, they all die relatively quickly. In fact, the last one dies somewhere probably around day 900. But then the DR animals, quite a significant fraction, and maybe almost half of them are still alive at that point. And actually, the last rat to die in the dietary restricted thing has done almost 50% lifespan extension. Absolutely incredible. And again, these animals weren't just hobbling along in ill health, unable to muster the energy even to die, while most of their colleagues had already copped it. These were animals that were looking much healthier. They were looking fitter. They were scurrying around. They had better fur, which is something that's often reported in these rat experiments. I guess that's just very obvious to the experimenters looking at them in the cage. And then when these animals did eventually die, they did little rat post-mortems, they cut them up, and they noticed that the rats that had died after dietary restriction basically looked the same as the rats that had died potentially hundreds of days earlier on a normal diet. So it really did seem like this was globally slowing down the aging process. And this is what happens if you try it in monkeys. So I'd like you to guess now, and again, it's going to have to be a silent guess because of the format, but these two monkeys, which one do you think is the older? I realize the way that I've laid this out, it sort of looks like 3 monkeys in a row here. Well, the answer is that Kanto is 25 and Owen is 27. Frustratingly, Owen is actually the older one, as well as looking the older. But actually, this is a very small difference in life, in age. Given that these monkeys can live sort of to 30 or maybe 35 years old. The difference is obviously that Kanto is on dietary restriction, whereas Owen was one of the monkeys that was eating whatever he liked. And you can see it's really taken its toll. He's got saggy skin, he's got patchier fur, he's got these skin lesions as well. He just doesn't look as fit and healthy and youthful, frankly, as Kanto does. Even to us, even if you're not even if you're not a monkey biologist who's used to looking at these animals, it's very obvious what the difference is. And what we find in the monkeys, I said it was something that maybe worked in monkeys. There were 2 different experiments actually that explored this. Both of them found that it increased the monkey's health span, so it increased the amount of time they lived healthily, which is definitely something we can all aspire to increasing. But the effects on lifespan are much more ambiguous, and if you want, we can talk about that in the Q&A. But basically, this raises the question whether or not it would actually work in humans. Maybe it doesn't work in animals that are more closely related to us. Maybe it doesn't work in animals that are longer lived like we are. There are a variety of different arguments out there. But nonetheless, this dietary restriction idea is a very robust finding, and it's something that's allowed us to go into a lot more detail to study how the aging process works by looking for things that are slowed down in dietarily restricted animals and proceed obviously at the normal pace in animals that are eating whatever they want. The idea is that we could take some of these processes that happen in dietary restriction and emulate them using drugs rather than having to do all that fasting. And the first the first reliably discovered dietary restriction mimetic, we're going to have to take a little bit of a world tour. We're going to have to go, unfortunately, virtually, of course, given the current situation, to one of the most remote places in the inhabited world. It's a place called Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. It's a Polynesian island in the Pacific, about 3,500 kilometers from the coast of Chile. So it's an incredibly isolated community. And if you've heard of Easter Island, it's probably because of these incredible moai statues, these huge stone heads sunken for reasons not entirely clear into the soil on the island. And an expedition there back in the 1960s actually managed to bring back a soil sample. And in the 70s, when scientists were sort of leafing through these soil samples, they found a bacterium in this soil that produced a compound that went on to be called rapamycin, named after Rapa Nui, the island. And what they found is that this basically mimics the process of dietary restriction. It goes into the cell and interferes with a protein called mTOR, which is something that senses when you've had a meal, senses nutrients, and it can interfere with that and make your body think that it's hungry, even when it actually isn't. And what it's found is that it extends life in yeast, in worms, in flies. And in 2009, scientists wanted to do an experiment to find out if it worked in mice. There were various experimental problems, which means they actually couldn't give the rapamycin to the mice until they were already pretty old. But incredibly, even though they started giving these mice rapamycin about 2 years old, that's about 70-ish, or 60 or 70 in human years, because mice obviously have a much shorter lifespan than us, this nonetheless extended their healthy lifespan. So this really does feel like it's got potential for human translation. We've got a few sort of tentative results in humans. There's a rapalog, which is something that works very much like rapamycin itself, but works using a slightly different chemistry. And that's been shown to improve response to flu vaccines in humans. We think that clinical trial data are still coming in. The problem with rapamycin is the side effects. It can act as an immunosuppressant. It can cause diabetes. It can cause hair loss, mouth ulcers, slowed wound healing, and fertility problems, particularly in men. There was a particularly striking statistic I found in a paper where they'd given rapamycin to mice, and they discovered that the male mice testes had shrunk by 80%. So that's obviously something for the guys in the audience to think about if they're thinking of trying some rapamycin to extend their lifespan. But the hope is that by perhaps reducing the dose down to a level where these side effects are less significant, it could nonetheless still extend lifespan, or by looking for these rapalogs, these other compounds that basically do the same kind of thing, we could have more of the life extension and health extension benefits, but less of the unpleasant side effects. There's also a drug called Metformin that I'd like to talk about very quickly. It's a very, very common drug. It's a drug that's used for diabetes. It's millions and millions of prescriptions are written for every year. And it's very, very safe. We really understand the safety profile. What's exciting about it is that this is data from a UK study. It's another one of those survival curves. And what you can see, again, we've got from 100 to 75% this time, because thankfully not all humans in this trial died. And we've got the number of years along the bottom. And what you can see is they're actually trying to, the main aim of the trial was to test metformin against another kind of diabetes drug called sulfonylureas. This is the survival curve for sulfonylureas. You can see the patients sort of dying off at a fairly steady rate. This is the survival curve for metformin. You can see the patients are dying much more slowly. So, clearly the sort of primary endpoint of this trial shows metformin is a better diabetes drug, at least in terms of survival, than sulfonylureas are. But as a sort of, to be really, fully scientific about this, they also included a control group. And this was a control group of people who weren't taking metformin, and therefore they weren't diabetic. So this is a group of people who, because they didn't have diabetes, they tended to be healthier, they tended to be less overweight than the group who are in the diabetic group taking metformin. And nonetheless, this is their survival curve. It's not quite as good as the diabetics taking metformin. And that's a really intriguing result, because it suggests that even though they were healthier, they're not living quite so long. And so the question that raises is, can we use metformin in order, can we give it to people who are healthy? And would that then knock their survival curve above that of the people who are diabetics taking metformin? That's the aim of a trial called TAME, which stands for Targeting Aging with Metformin, that was supposed to start in the States around now, but has unfortunately been delayed because of coronavirus. It's going to follow about 3,000 people and see if it's going to give 1,500 of them the metformin, 1,500 the placebo. The problem with that previous trial that I mentioned is that it was an observational study, so you can't necessarily tease out, were there some systematic differences between the group taking metformin because they were diabetic and the group who weren't doing so. It could be that, for example, that diabetics, because they're constantly in the healthcare system, other problems get caught earlier, and so that's the reason they're living longer. It might not be to do with the metformin they're taking. So this is a proper randomized trial that should seek to answer that question. And this is a really interesting trial for a couple of different reasons. Or the first reason, actually, it's a revolutionary trial and a thoroughly unrevolutionary trial, I think is what I should say. And I'll start with the reason it's very unrevolutionary. And that is simply this graph that I've already shown you. As you can see, it's not as though taking metformin is probably going to add 10 years to your lifespan. It's not going to slow down your aging to an incredible degree, because the difference between those two curves is actually quite small. It's statistically significant. It's clinically significant. It's enough to worry about. It might add a few months to your life, and it might add a few months to your health span, but it's not going to knock anything out of the park. The thing that's more exciting about the TAME trial than the potential effects is the fact they worked very closely with the FDA, which is the regulator in the US, to make sure that this process they're going through to try and actually target the aging process is going to be extensible to other drugs that might be a little bit more exciting. Because the problem is, at the moment, it's very hard to get a drug approved if what it does is it targets the aging process rather than targeting a specific disease. So TAME is hopefully paving the way for what will be probably more exciting anti-aging drugs that come in the future. So I talked about those two things. They're both basically dietary restriction mimetic drugs. Metformin is a bit more complicated, but they seek to sort of globally slow down the aging process in quite a diffuse way. But I thought I'd come back to this slide and ask this question: what is aging? And this is the list of things that I gave you before. But I think what's really exciting is that we're finally beginning to drill down into what aging actually is, rather than just these things that are basically endpoints. And it's worth dwelling on this for a minute, because I've sort of cheated when I've made this slide. Actually, most of the words, or all of the words on here, can be caused by a huge variety of different things. So, I mean, take cancer, for example. There are hundreds of different kinds of cancer, which I've encapsulated in a single word. There are lots of different ways you can get dementia. There are lots of different ways you can get hearing loss, and so on and so on. And the way that we treat all of these is very much one at once. If you find a lump, you might go to a GP. The GP might refer you to an oncologist. If they do a biopsy and it turns out to be cancerous, then you'll end up getting chemotherapy or radiotherapy, or you get an operation. And they'll treat your cancer, but they'll basically leave the rest of your health broadly alone. And the problem is that we're picking off these diseases one at a time when they're already very far advanced in their development. So this is really problematic. It's a very, very hard time to treat those diseases. What we'd rather do is treat before these diseases come into being, treat the causes of those diseases and prevent them from happening in the first place. So when you ask a biologist what is aging, the fortunate thing is that now we've got a fairly good idea, and this is what the list looks like. This is the list of what are called the hallmarks of aging, the hallmarks that I've used in my book. They're slightly modified from a 2013 paper of the same name, also called the hallmarks of aging. That paper only had 9. I think I added a couple and combined one, or I can't quite remember exactly what happened, but basically I ended up with 10 because I've done it in a slightly different way. But what's exciting about these is not only have we got these various different causes, there are a few things that are exciting around it. Firstly, is the list is comparatively short. Obviously, some of these are headings rather than exact particular causes, but nonetheless, it's a shorter list than the list of all the different myriad things that can go wrong with your body as you get older. So that's the first exciting thing. And the second exciting thing is that each of these causes has a variety of different ways that we can try and intervene directly to reverse or slow down that particular change happening. And this is why I call aging medicine the biggest revolution since the discovery of antibiotics, because just like penicillin can treat a variety of different bacterial diseases, intervening in one of these hallmarks can potentially prevent a variety of different age-related diseases. And in fact, in that sense, because it's preventative rather than curative, it could even be more exciting than antibiotics. Now, obviously, you'll be relieved to hear I've not got time to go through the whole list, but what I'm going to do is just select a couple, one of which is very commonly asked about and I think is quite exciting, and one of which I think is the most exciting thing going on in aging science at the moment. The first one we're going to start with is looking at telomere length and how that changed with age and what we can do about it. So this is a beautiful microscopy image. I'm always very jealous of microscopists when they give their talks at biology conferences, because they always have these gorgeous images. This is a fluorescence image, and what you can see is the blue stuff is DNA, and it's gathered together into chromosomes. You can see that a lot of them look like a sort of X shape. That's the classic, X that chromosomes are supposed to look like when they're bundled together when the cells are dividing. So the blue stuff is basically the bulk of the DNA, most of the genetic code. And then the red and the green bits at either end are their telomeres. The telomeres at the start and the end of the chromosome. So that's what a telomere is. It's a region of DNA at the start and the end of the chromosome. And if you zoom in, it will look something like this. This is obviously a very simplified version of just the letters, but DNA is made up of these 4 chemical letters. And what you see in the telomere isn't a huge complicated code. It's just TTA, GGG, TTA, GGG, hundreds or maybe even thousands of times. And what that does then is it's a load of repeated nonsense on the end of the chromosome, and it fulfills a variety of different functions. The first of those functions is that it protects our chromosomes from being DNA repaired. And that might sound strange, why we want to protect from repair. The answer is that if your cells find loose bits of DNA dangling around, it tends to try and sew them together because it assumes there's been there's a problem. Your DNA shouldn't have loose ends floating about. And so these telomeres are understood by your DNA repair machinery to be the ends of chromosomes and nothing to worry about. And the second problem that it solves is a strange evolutionary mistake. It seems bizarre that evolution hasn't sorted this after all the billions of years it's had to try. But when our DNA gets copied every time a cell divides, it copies all the way along the DNA. But unfortunately, for some reason, that enzyme can't quite make it to the end of the DNA. You can sort of imagine it like a builder going along a wall, putting on new bricks, but she has to stand on the wall at the same time as she's doing the building. And so it means that she can't put that final brick down on the place that she's standing. And so inevitably that wall is going to get a bit shorter every time she tries to put a new layer of bricks on top. And that's exactly what happens inside our cells. Every time our cells divide, they lose maybe a few tens or hundreds of these bases, these DNA letters. And actually, if you look at people over the course of their life, this is how old the people are along the bottom, and up the sides, how long their telomeres are in bases. So you can see they're thousands of bases long. This is what the graph looks like. It's not a really, really strong trend. It's not as though you can literally read off exactly how old people are. And what you can see is that some people who are in their 90s, so these people around here, for example, have telomeres that are as long as people who are in their, the lower end of the telomere length scale in their 40s. And you've got to wonder who this person is up here. Is that telomere Wolverine? But ultimately, apart from these, weird outliers, there is a general trend here. And this general trend is that something like 20 bases per year of shortening happens in these particular cells. These are white blood cells that are often analyzed for telomere length. And so it seems like an obvious candidate for a cause of aging, this, because it's something that, these telomeres are getting shorter when our cells divide. As we get older, obviously our cells have to divide to replace cells that are being lost in various tissues in the body. So their telomeres reduce in length. We can see that there's a trend toward reduction in length with age. We also know that people who have short telomeres for their age tend to be less healthy. They tend to have less life ahead of them. They tend to be more susceptible to age-related diseases. So this really seems like it could be a cause of aging. So the question is there something that we can do to lengthen those telomeres and reverse the problem? The answer is an enzyme called telomerase, which was discovered in the 80s, and it got a Nobel Prize actually in 2009 to Elizabeth Blackburn, Carol Greider, and a guy called Jack Shostak, who helped them out with some work in yeast. And the idea is that if you give this enzyme, you might be able to extend the telomeres. This is an enzyme that naturally exists in our bodies already. It's used at various points in life. For example, when we reproduce, we need to make sure that our children have very long telomeres, so they don't just, they aren't prematurely aged, basically, they aren't born old. So clearly it's something that is used in parts of our body, and there are actually certain parts of our adult body where the telomere is used, where telomerase is used as well. But actually it's deactivated in most cells. And the reason is, that might sound stupid. Why don't we just activate that telomerase and live longer by having longer telomeres? The answer is that it's a cancer defense mechanism. So cancer basically is a cell that gains the ability to reproduce an infinite number of times. And that means it can grow big enough to become a tumor. That tumor can then metastasize, so it can move, spread around your body. That's how cancer goes on to ultimately kill you. So the idea is that the telomeres, by being fixed in length and by not having telomerase activated, they get shorter and shorter and shorter. And so if a cell does try and divide an infinite number of times, then it'll very rapidly run out of telomere. And when the telomeres get too short, what's called critically short, then the cell stops dividing and enters a state called cellular senescence. So hold that thought, we're going to come back to that in a minute. But these senescent cells, because they can't divide, therefore can't, by definition, turn into a cancer, whose definition is that it can divide an infinite number of times. So telomeres are this cancer defense mechanism. So, this would be a useful thing to have, perhaps, but also if we were to turn telomerase on in cells, then it's effectively pre-ticking a box on cancer's list. It allows it to, escape this problem of telomere shortening that stops cancer from becoming a problem in certain situations. And in fact, if you get some mice and you give them telomerase, so you activate that gene all of the time, the result is that not they live longer, they get lots and lots of cancer. And these experiments were first done in the late 90s, early 2000s. And, this basically proved this idea that, and also it's got this very cynical undertone, because you've got some treatment that's supposed to be able to slow down the aging process, maybe even reverse it. And actually, of course, all it does is gives mice cancer. So what had been a real excitement around telomerase in the 90s rapidly turned into a very cynical narrative where, clearly this doesn't work. It was an oversimplification. Luckily, we've done more work in recent years that have made this simple picture seem rather more exciting. There's a group headed by a woman called Maria Blasco in Spain, and they've been doing a variety of experiments on telomerase. And this one was done in about 2008. They added not just telomerase to the mice, but a number of other genes. And these genes do various different things, but they're basically cancer protective. They're genes that cause cells to stop growing or commit suicide if they look like they're turning cancerous. Biologists in the audience might be familiar with P53, which is often known as the guardian of the genome, which amongst other functions basically goes around checking that your cells are behaving as they should, their DNA is behaving as they should, and causes them to commit suicide or to stop dividing if that's not the case. And if you combine telomerase with these anti-cancer genes, what they found was that the mice live, or you can just about see that, the mice live 40% longer and they don't get any extra cancer. So clearly, this telomerase trade-off, it's something that our bodies have made in a certain specific way because of the manner in which we've evolved, but perhaps it is something that we can optimize and improve when we look at when we're trying to use gene therapy or maybe other kinds of medicine to reawaken that telomerase in us. And they've also done some other experiments more recently where rather than activating the telomerase permanently, they just turned it on temporarily. So they gave it in a kind of gene therapy that pops into the cell, produces a bit of telomerase, then basically gets degraded. So it only produces the telomerase for a short period of time. And what they found was, again, they lived a little bit longer and they didn't get any extra cancer. So that seems like really good news. So this telomerase, it's gone from a sort of life-giving immortality enzyme in the 90s to an unloved cancer-causing enzyme in the noughties. And now, thankfully, thanks to some more nuanced experiments, it's showing that maybe this is something that could be a helpful idea in our anti-aging future. So I said that I'd go into two of the categories on this list. That one was looking at trimmed telomeres. We're now going to look at senescent cells. I said to hold that thought because one of the ways that cells can become senescent is by having their telomeres get too short. Now, the idea behind senescent cells, well, they were first discovered in the lab in a dish in the 1960s. There was a guy called Leonard Hayflick, and he was watching cells called fibroblasts divide. And he noticed that after a certain number of divisions, these cells, they stopped dividing was the first thing. After about 50 divisions, they just stopped. And also they looked weird, and you don't have to be a sort of cell microscopy specialist, again, in order to see this. They exhibit what's called sometimes called the fried egg phenotype, sorry, because they're just like a massive splattered out fried egg. It's very obvious they're different from these healthy, youthful, dividing fibroblasts. And so the question then becomes, if this is something that can happen to cells in a dish, it can happen outside the body. Is it the aging of cells inside our body, this becoming senescent, that causes the aging of our bodies as a whole? And the experiments in the intervening decades have shown that there's certainly at least a grain of truth to this, because senescent cells accumulate in a lot of our tissues as we get older. And they do so, as they do so, they accelerate the aging process, basically. And that's because a lot of cells end their life by, I already mentioned this, the idea of cell suicide. So if you've got loads of damage in your DNA or you've divided too many times, the sort of cleanest way to end your life is just to do exactly that, is to commit suicide, is sort of fall on your sword for the good of the rest of the body. Because you're a multicellular organism, the fate of individual cells doesn't really matter. But unfortunately, for reasons that we don't fully understand, some cells, rather than committing cell suicide in a process called apoptosis, actually end up going senescent. And that's not as bad as continuing to divide, obviously, because if you're a cell, again, as I said before, looking like you're going to become a cancer, not dividing is a much safer place to be. But unfortunately, what they do then isn't just sit there benignly not dividing, sort of elders of the cellular community. They start emitting this toxic cocktail of molecules. And what those molecules are for, ultimately, is to attract the immune system. Because what they're saying is, I'm senescent, I'm broken, I'm over here, help. And they're trying to attract an immune cell over to gobble them up and get rid of the problem. And actually, when we're young, that's mostly what happens. There are senescent cells being produced in your body, my body, all the time. And if you're young enough, thankfully, your senescent cells produce these, what are called inflammatory molecules. The immune system will come over, something called a macrophage usually, will come over and gobble that cell up. It'll be removed from the system and everything's fine. But unfortunately, as we get older, a variety of different processes mean that that is no longer done quite so efficiently. The first problem is that these senescent cells are being produced more frequently. So, things like DNA damage that accumulates throughout your life because of a lot of it's just random side effects of being alive. But it can be things like sun exposure or alcohol or the food we eat, or environmental toxins can damage our DNA too. Nonetheless, it's cumulative. So as you're older, more and more of the DNA in your cells is damaged, so more of them go senescent that way. I also said that cells can become senescent when they've divided too many times. And again, as you get older, your telomeres are getting shorter because your cells are dividing more and more, and that can mean that those cells end up going senescent. And there's also something called a stress-based senescence, where the cells become senescent just because they're in a stressed out internal environment. And the older body is a much more stressful place to be for a cell, and therefore they can go senescent for that reason as well. So you end up with this increasing number of senescent cells by a variety of different processes. On the other side, your immune system is getting less effective. Actually, ironically, one reason of which is that your immune cells are becoming senescent themselves. But there's also this process I mentioned earlier called chronic inflammation, where all of these inflammatory molecules, in fact, some of which are these inflammatory molecules emitted by the senescent cells, put your immune system on this constant state of paranoia. And sort of counterintuitively, although it's getting paranoid, it's getting hyperactive in your old age, it actually makes it less effective at the tasks it's supposed to be doing. So it's less effective at fighting infection, less effective at catching precancerous cells, and less effective at clearing out senescent cells too. So these cells gradually increase in number. And actually, it's thought that these chronic inflammatory molecules are the way in which senescent cells contribute to aging. So as they continue to give out these molecules, they're constantly saying, help, I'm still here, come and get me, immune system, and the immune system fails to do so. What that can do is effectively accelerate the aging process in a variety of different ways. So again, that's the sort of depressing side. That's what actually happens inside a mouse's body or your body as you age. And what was really exciting, back in 2011, the first experiment was done that showed that removing these senescent cells can actually improve mouse health and lifespan. And fast forward a few more years, this could be done with drugs as well. Scientists identified some drugs, one called dasatinib, which is a chemotherapy drug, and one called quercetin, which is actually often found in supplements. It's a flavanol molecule that's found in fruit and veg and that kind of thing. And when they're administered together, what these can do is kill senescent cells, but leave other cells relatively intact. And so if you administer this to mice, and actually this happened about the same time as the mice given rapamycin, they gave it at 24 months. What you find is that the mice, they're 70-ish in human years, just to recap that, so they're old mice. But in spite of being given this combination of drugs that late, it basically makes them biologically younger. So they live a bit longer, which I guess is the most obvious thing. They live maybe a month and a half, 2 months longer or something like that, which is a few years in human terms maybe. But also, again, they live longer in good health. They get less cancer, they get fewer heart problems, they get fewer cataracts. They can run further and faster on a little mousy treadmill. And again, they have better fur, which, as I said, it always seems to be reported in these mouse and rat papers when you read them. So what this shows is that these senescent cells are accelerating the aging process in a very global way. They aren't targeting any one specific disease. And by removing them, you are reversing the aging process, again, in this very global way. You're reversing many different diseases at once. You're even reversing these superficial signs like, reduced quality of fur in the case of mice, or perhaps, hair loss and hair graying and wrinkling and that sort of stuff in humans. So this is a really exciting idea, the idea that by treating a root cause of aging, you can slow down many different aspects of the aging process all at once. And what's most exciting about these senolytic drugs is that they're actually already entering human trials. So back in 2018, the first human trial of a senolytic started. I already mentioned actually that it's quite hard to get approval for a drug that slows down aging. So it's quite likely that the first approvals of these drugs are going to be for conditions which are known to have a component related to those senescent cells, but not necessarily for aging as a whole. So for example, they've been used in trials for arthritis, which is a process that's known to be driven by inflammation and driven by senescent cells. For age-related macular degeneration, which is the most common form of blindness in older people. And there's also a trial for something called idiopathic, I can't even say it myself, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which is a kind of lung fibrosis. It's, again, much more common in older people than it is in younger, and thought to be driven by this inflammation and formation of senescent cells. And hopefully, if those drugs are safe, they're effective, if they can treat these age-related diseases, then it might not be that long before we're doling out these pills, not just to people who are actually ill, but people who are just in their 50s or 60s and therefore have a burden of these senescent cells, but not one that's high enough yet to have caused them significant ill health. And that's the really exciting idea here, is that we could use these drugs not as treatments, but as preventions, ways to slow and reverse this global process that results in so much ill health and dysfunction in late life. So that's what really excites me about these kinds of anti-aging therapies. And obviously, as I said, I'm not going to go through this whole list, but if you can go through every single item on this list, and actually that's basically how my book is structured, is to look at all these different items, things that we can do to slow down and reverse those changes and affect the whole aging process. So right at the end of the talk, I thought I'd ask this question, which is a bit of a strange one in some ways, because it's not a question that you normally see at the end of a science talk. Imagine I just given a talk on cancer research, for example. It would be deeply weird for me to have a slide at the end saying, should we cure cancer? But as soon as you start talking about curing aging, and this is something that I like to do, because although it's not necessarily something I think is going to happen soon, I think it basically I want to start a debate. I want to show people that aging is something that we should be seeking to cure. We should be seeking to do something medically about. Then people place this in a very different ethical category to curing other kinds of disease. So I thought I'd sort of get my defense in first, sort of thing, by looking at one of the examples of questions that I often get when I tell people that I'm working on, when I told people I was working on a book on aging. And I hope that you'll be able to see that this does actually generalize to some extent, because I think there are lots of huge social ethical quandaries, head scratchers that you could debate for hours. You could write a whole second or third book on. But actually, I think the moral case for aging is watertight, because none of these objections are as big as the problem of aging itself, which I'll explain in a moment. So the first and most common question that you get is, if we cure aging, won't that cause overpopulation? Won't we have loads and loads of incredibly old, incredibly healthy people just clustering up the place, using loads of carbon, using loads of other resources, using loads of land, polluting the atmosphere, etc., etc. Aren't we going to end up on an Earth that's just not worth living on? So there are two ways that you can answer this question. I'm going to start by answering it in the specific sense of what would actually happen if we were to cure aging. So let's have a look first at what's happened so far. This is what's happened to the population up until roughly the present day. We know that back in 1999, the population passed 6 billion. Back in 2011, it passed 7 billion. And we're closing on the 8 billion people mark. And then we can project forward to what we think is going to happen. This is what's called the medium variant. It's the UN's projection of what they think is the most likely thing to happen to global population over the next few decades. And they think that by 2050, there'll be about 9.7 billion people. Now, in order to work out what treatments for aging might look like on this, I thought I'd go for the most extreme case, because I'm not an expert in demographic modeling by any stretch. So rather than do some incredibly intricate, careful model, I thought what I'd do is just turn off death. I'd say we're not just going to cure aging; we're actually going to cure all, anything that people are just going to stop dying in 2025. Now, you can argue whether or not that would be a good or a bad thing, but the fact is that if you're a population pessimist, that is the worst case scenario, because if literally nobody dies anymore, that is the worst it can possibly be. Maybe you're an optimist about this and think that's brilliant, there's going to be far less suffering, it's going to be a wonderful utopia. Nonetheless, it's the sort of most extreme scenario. So were we to cure death in 2025, this is what would happen to global population. By 2050, the population would be somewhere around 11.6 billion. Now, that's not nothing, but it's only about 20% larger than it would be otherwise. And when you think about, what we're talking about when we're talking about overpopulation, as I alluded to earlier, it's not the people that matter, it's their footprint on the planet. And, so the thing that we need to reduce isn't necessarily the number of people. As long as we can reduce how much impact they're having on the planet, then basically it amounts to the same thing. And I'd happily work 20% harder by 2050 to cure things like climate change, to reduce the amount of land use we use, to reduce all of these other massive global problems, if it meant that what we could do as our sort of, what we get on the other side of that balance is a cure for aging, which I've already said, I think is the single largest cause of death and suffering in the world. I'd happily work 20% harder to solve other problems in order to, get on top of that one. It's also worth noting there's quite a large uncertainty on these population projections, and the UN actually don't make any assumptions about what's going to happen to death rates or what's going to happen to life expectancy. Those uncertainty bands that are added on there, that's the low and the high variant around the median variant. And the reason that those are there is because of potential for changes in birth rates. So you can see that, changes in death rates are potentially going to make a smaller difference than changes in birth rates. And the reason is that effectively, changes in birth rates are exponential, because if you have more kids, they can then go on to have more kids who can then have more kids. Whereas if you just stop people dying, then that's only a linear type of growth. So it seems to be, it's less important for population overall. So basically, I think this is probably quite a small effect. As I've said, this is the most extreme scenario. If we manage less than curing death in 2025, and remember, this isn't just scientifically implausible. This is implausible from a logistical perspective as well, because we'd have to distribute all those treatments, in the next 5 years or so, next 4 years now, or in 2021. So this is a ridiculous extreme scenario, and yet it's still something that I think is absolutely manageable by comparison to what a cure for aging would deliver. So, as I said, there are loads of other ethical questions, but I think the simplest way to answer them, and is sort of what I got at toward the end of answering that question, and to put it in slightly more explicit terms, when people ask me these moral questions, like what about overpopulation? Won't dictators live forever? What won't only the rich have access to these treatments and that kind of thing? These are all knotty issues that are worthy of exploration. But I think the best way to answer them quickly is to switch that whole question around and to say, imagine we lived in a world where there wasn't any aging. And we had one of these terrible problems. We had huge overpopulation. We had some immortal dictator somewhere. Would you invent aging to solve that problem? I think the answer is an emphatic no, because say you've got a dictator somewhere who's terrorizing his citizens, and he's going to be ruling over them for potentially thousands of years. What kind of monster would say what we need to do is kill off the entire global population with this not just instantly, at a certain age, but with this sort of slow process of degeneration and decrepitude, which ends up with these horrible diseases that might take years or decades to take your life? There's absolutely no way that's a sane answer to a question like, immortal dictators or overpopulation. And I think the moral case is equally watertight when you reverse the question back to our current situation and say, should we allow aging to persist in order to hopefully solve some of these problems? I think the answer, again, is just an absolutely emphatic no. And I think the reason that it feels a bit more uncomfortable this way around is just because we're so used to the status quo. We're used to, we literally have a lifetime to get used to the idea of growing old and dying. It's something that's happened to every generation of humans and many generations of different animals that have come before us. Our pets' age, our farm animals' age, it's just everywhere, all around us. And so we're so used to it. It requires a huge sort of paradigm shift in our minds to get to the point where we can understand that aging is something that we can cure, and in fact that we should be trying to cure. And fundamentally, the reason that I want to do this is because I think it's a really neglected problem. I'd like to illustrate that by making not a human case, but an economic one. So let's have a look at the US, and let's have a look at how much aging costs the US economy. Now, I'm not going to look at the whole of aging. I'm just going to look at my four favorites, the wrong word, but the four top killing age-related diseases, four most common age-related diseases. I'm going to look at how much they cost the economy. And this is just this isn't just the direct costs of healthcare. This is also the indirect costs. So it's things like people giving up work because they're too unwell, or people giving up work in order to look after an elderly friend or relative or something like that. So obviously that reduces economic output as well. Cancer costs almost 300 billion, heart disease 200 billion, stroke 110 billion, dementia very expensive, even though it's not very deadly because people obviously live for it with a long time and need an awful lot of care. So you can see that what we've got here is, well, a significant fraction of $1 trillion. And this is the annual cost of these diseases. And then let's have a look at how much the US spends on the National Institute for Aging, the NIA budget. It's about $3.5 billion. And that little square there isn't just a bullet point. It's actually obviously in proportion to the amount of money that's being spent there. So you can see it's a tiny fraction of the cost of these chronic diseases. And obviously these chronic diseases aren't the total cost of aging. They're just the four sort of top diseases that I could think of. So then what we can do is actually look at the NIA budget. Now you might be thinking, well, that's small, but it's not so bad. But actually it is quite bad, because there's a running joke in the biogerontology community that NIA doesn't stand for National Institute on Aging, but it stands for National Institute on Alzheimer's. And that's because if you break the budget down, the neuroscience division of the NIA, which basically looks primarily at Alzheimer's disease, gets 2 of those 3.5 billion. Then other activities there you can see get about one and a bit billion. And that leaves just $350 million for the actual aging biology part of the NIA, the part that looks specifically at the mechanisms of aging. And actually it's even worse than that suggests, because the aging biology division, a lot of their work is very sort of fundamental research. It's looking at what are the processes that cause aging, how many senescent cells do we have at different points in our life, and that kind of stuff. It's not explicitly concentrating on looking for cures to diseases. And so, it's fairly safe to say that if you do the maths, somewhere less than 1 in 10,000 of the amount that's spent on healthcare in the US is spent on actually looking for treatments that might be able to address the aging process. And even from an economic standpoint, that's just balmy, before you come onto the huge humanitarian, social, ethical cost that these age-related diseases actually go on to cause in society. So that's fundamentally why I wrote this book. I really want to raise awareness about this stuff. I want lots more people to be talking about curing aging as a thing, whether it's with your friends down the pub, whether it's scientists, because I know that this is something that during my career in biology, I realized was massively underappreciated by biologists too. At UCL, you're lucky enough to have quite a strong aging department, so you probably do get some lectures as biology undergrads, but in a lot of universities around the country, a biology undergrad or a doctor won't have any lectures in aging biology, which is just crazy considering it's one of the most fundamental processes in biology and one of the leading causes of disease. We also need voters and policymakers to understand this stuff as well, because we need them to start investing that money that I talked about on the previous slide. So I just want everybody to be talking about this, and I thought the best way to do that was to try and write a book and get the word out. I've just got a few links in case you're interested. If you want to get a copy of the book, you can go to ageless.link, and there are various places that you can get it from. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Stato, and I've also got a YouTube channel, which is Dr Andrew Steele, as you can see, all one word. I haven't put out a huge number of videos lately because I've been quite busy for some reason with the book coming out, but yeah, if you're interested, please do go to one of those few places. And thank you very much. I think I've got time for a few questions.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much. So if
you
you guys would like to type your questions in the chat, or you can unmute and ask your question. So I just want to get it started with, while we wait for these developments and treatments and everything for aging, is there anything that you'd recommend that people can do in their day-to-day lives to try and increase their lifespan other than eating healthy?
Yeah, and I've got a health advice chapter in the book, actually, and some of the advice is surprisingly obvious, but it's eating healthily, it's exercising, it's that kind of stuff. But one thing I found that writing a book on aging really really increased my focus in terms of trying to do those really basic things. And the reason's twofold. The first reason is that these ideas actually slow down the aging process on, in quite a fundamental way. These things, that is genuinely what they're doing. They're preventing all these diseases by slowing down different aspects of aging, and that really encouraged me to get on board. And secondly, I think we're living at this pivotal time in history where these anti-aging treatments are slowly being developed. We're going to get to a point quite soon where where these drugs are available. And that means that the longer that you can live in good health by exercising, by eating healthily and that kind of thing, the more chance you have of being alive when some of these advanced treatments get developed. And that's actually amplified by the fact that treatments are being developed all the time. So by the time I'm in my 60s and 70s, I really hope we've got some good senolytics. We might have a few gene therapies that I can do. Those maybe the sort of basic first gene therapies against aging. By the time you guys, if you're undergraduate students who are watching and you're not a mature student, then you're going to be there could be loads and loads of huge advances in biomedicine by that time. So there's just a huge incentive from a purely personal, selfish point of view, if you want to benefit from this stuff, to try and live as long and healthily as possible.
Thank you. That's great. So we've got a question from Susan. She says, is geographical situation significant when it comes to aging?
It is, unfortunately, yeah. And I sort of allude to this a tiny bit in the book, but it's more a sort of social science question. But what you find is that people in the poorest parts of countries can often have dramatically lower life expectancies than people in the richest parts. And there's a really striking, if you look online, there's a tube map of life expectancy in London. And there's a few stops on the Victoria line. I think it's between Green Park and Vauxhall, where the life expectancy drops by about 20 years just as you basically cross the river. And obviously that's because everyone in Green Park is has a very, very high socioeconomic, is in a very high socioeconomic group, whereas obviously South London is much, much poorer. So there are these huge disparities. And places like Glasgow has a particularly low life expectancy. Places like Blackpool, there are all kinds of places around the UK and the US where even though perhaps overall life expectancy in those two countries is roughly stalling at the moment, unfortunately, there have been significant drops in certain groups. And I think that's, when you talk to social scientists about this, they obviously get very, I've even had some social scientists who are like exasperated with the idea of medical treatments for aging. We're in this situation where there's huge inequality, and can't we just bring everyone up to the currently existing sort of state-of-the-art standard of living? And I think actually these treatments for aging are going to be really important for people who are poorer, because it's obviously you shouldn't medicalize every problem, and you can't solve everything with an anti-aging pill. But equally, a lot of the problems that afflict poorer communities, things like lack of exercise or things like smoking, are effectively, as I sort of said in the last answer, they're accelerating the aging process because they're doing the negative sides of these pieces of health advice. And so if I had an anti-aging pill that could solve at least part of that problem in a really simple way just by giving people medicines, I'd rather be in that world if I was trying to solve these social problems and solve that inequality than purely having, trying to improve exercise, trying to reduce smoking as my policy levers.
Brilliant, thank you. So the next question is from Shreyas, who says, has the microbiome been implicated strongly in accelerating or decelerating aging?
Was that microbiome?
Yeah.
It hasn't been implicated strongly, but there are definitely signs that it's going to be significant. It's the one hallmark in my book that isn't in the hallmarks of aging paper, because the science on this has been moving so fast and it's really sort of emerged in the last few years. I think the most exciting piece of experimental evidence that we got for this is an experiment using an animal called the tortoise killifish, which are these very short-lived fish. They live about 4 or 5 months normally. I think it might even be 3 or 4 months. They've got an incredibly short lifespan, because what they do is they live in these they're called ephemeral ponds in Africa. So basically in the rainy season, the rain all comes down, you get these, anything from a puddle to a small lake can form, and these eggs suddenly hatch. The fish basically have to go about their business, have their whole life cycle, reproduce, lay some more eggs in that tiny period of time before those ponds evaporate. And they're a really useful model system for aging biology, because they live such a short time, you can obviously do those experiments rather than having to wait 80 years and watch a human. You can have these experiments happen much more quickly. And they did a microbiome-based experiment with these fish. They got a bunch of old killifish and they cleared out their microbiome with a really powerful cocktail of antibiotics. And then they allowed them to share a tank with younger fish, and they basically ended up exchanging the microbiomes. And old fish given a younger microbiome turn out to basically get biologically younger, as is my sort of common go-to phrase, whatever the intervention seems to be. They lived longer, and they seemed, it's harder to tell in fish, what good health comprises, but they darted around the tank more than fish of the same age who hadn't had that microbiome transplant. So that really suggests that there's something going on. And there have been some experiments in mice. We know that microbiome transplants are a thing in humans because they're used to treat infections like C. difficile. So it's not something that we've absolutely nailed down. We don't know which bacteria, what are the good bacteria, what are the bad bacteria, and we can't give that to someone in a pill yet. But I really feel like it's such a fast moving field. We're potentially going to have some treatments in the not too distant future. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you. We have a question from Chrissy who says, what target does metformin engage with to produce its effect? And what is the theory behind it having stronger anti-aging effects in diabetic people?
So I don't think we believe it to have stronger anti-aging effects in diabetics. That's what this that's what the TAME trial is looking to try and sort out. It's trying to work out whether the effect in people who haven't got diabetes is, stronger, weaker, the same, whatever. That's something that we just don't know. Because obviously, if you're not diabetic, most people, apart from a few biohackers who are sort of trying to get ahead of the curve here, don't take metformin unless they've got diabetes. In terms of targets, it is a filthy drug, and I'm not a sort of pharmacology expert, but it hits loads and loads of different things. It hits a sort of nexus of cellular metabolism called AMPK, which is again a sort of nutrient management system within the cell. It seems to have an effect on mitochondrial behavior, which I think might be through AMPK. I can't remember. It even has an effect actually on the microbiome. So it really does seem like it hits loads and loads of different targets. We probably haven't even got an exhaustive list, frankly, because the trouble with these small natural molecules, it was originally derived from a plant, they can interact with loads and loads of different parts of our biology. And so it's very, very hard to exactly work out what it does. So I sort of called it a dietary restriction mimetic. I think some scientists might contend that. I did it sort of as a sort of simplifying part, way to make the talk structure work a bit better, basically. But whether or not it actually is a dietary restriction mimetic, I'm sure you could have a nice bun fight at a biology conference about that.
Thank you. We have a question from Andre saying, is aging inherent? I know as you talked about the hydra, that perhaps it's not.
I don't think it is. I think it really varies depending, exactly as you said, depending on where you look in the tree of life. There are some animals that don't age. There are even some animals that seem to age negatively, in the sense that their risk of death reduces as they get older. And I think there's a whole chapter on this evolution of aging in the book. I think it really depends on the environment in which you grow up. And the basic level of this is that if you have a really hazardous natural environment, there are lots of predators and lots of disease, then you probably have quite a short lifespan, even with respect to aging, because the fact is you've got to your biology is going to prefer to gear up really quickly, make sure you can mate, have some children, and reproduce as fast as possible before you get eaten by something or die of a disease. Whereas if you're living in a more benign environment with fewer of these natural hazards, then your body can afford to invest more in anti-aging defenses. Basically, it can afford to build a body more carefully that's less likely to fall apart with time. It can afford to expend energy. It's basically spring cleaning. So those animals that live in a more benign environment tend to have longer lifespans and tend to be able to reproduce more slowly, have smaller litters and that kind of thing. So I really think it's very, very dependent on the environment in which you evolved. There's actually a fascinating theory that maybe the reason humans age, even though we do now, thankfully, live in a very benign environment, is because the last common ancestor of all mammals was basically a tiny shrew-like thing. And that will have lived in a very dangerous environment with loads and loads of predators. It's very small. It's, these animals often die of exposure in the wild. They just get so cold that they die. So they have to gear up and reproduce very quickly. And perhaps we've got limited genetic space. We're not able to go back to the negligible senescence, which, as I said, like fish and tortoises and various other animals have, because of this sort of evolutionary bottleneck. I'm not sure whether that's true. I don't know if we'll ever know whether that's true. But I think, yeah, it's certainly not the case that aging is universal, and it might just be that we're phenomenally unlucky to have it.
Thank you. And one last question from Chris and Victoria is, what is known on the effects of senolytics on the cells of the CNS and the heart?
That's a good question. And I think the answer is not very much. And obviously the reason that presumably you'd worry about that is because the CNS, central nervous system, the brain, basically, a lot of those neurons you get when you're born, you have them for life. And it's the same in the cells of the heart. It's a really fascinating and knotty question, because obviously you don't want to kill those cells in a lot of cases. If you have a senescent heart cell, you'd probably rather rescue it from its senescence, or suppress the SASP, the senescence associated secretory phenotype of these toxic molecules, rather than kill it and therefore have one fewer heart cell. But who knows? I think it's the experiments haven't been done to work out exactly which tissues, exactly which senolytics work in, and it will probably differ a bit from mice to humans, so it's something to watch. The other question is whether we can target the senolytics in such a way as to avoid those cells. So the reason that we end up with these neurons and heart cells that have been with us for our whole lives is because those cells don't divide typically, at least in certain regions of the brain and certain regions of the heart. And that means obviously if they're not dividing, their telomeres aren't getting shorter, at least in theory. The ways in which those cells go senescent or enter a state that is often called senescence, but some senescent cell biologists are quite annoyed, has been sort of lumped in with replicative senescence, as it's called, where the cells divide too many times. maybe we can come up with biological ways to distinguish between those cells and kill cells that are, genuinely, quote unquote, replicatively senescent, but do something different to cells in the heart or the brain that are senescent that are called senescent, but actually have a slightly different cellular behavior.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And everybody in the chat is also saying how amazing your PowerPoint and everything is. We are very impressed. So thank you for an incredible talk, and I'll just stop the recording there.